Every once in a while, well, not every once in a while, very often when I read things about the life of the Apostle Paul, I realize that this guy is completely different than me. He is on a wholly different level than you or me or anyone as far as his mission and what he is doing. And we're going to see that this morning. But when I see those things, when I hear that, I understand that Paul is just a different preacher than I am, a different kind of missionary than you or I ever will be. I don't say that and then cower in fear and say, well, throw up my hands and just give up and go home. But when I see the things that Paul does and I hear the things that Paul says, I hope you'll join with me in a prayer to say, Lord, give me a heart like Paul. Let me explain. So in Acts chapter 17, last week, we followed Paul into Thessalonica and then Berea. And the Bible tells us that Paul had to leave Berea for safety reasons. Apparently it was okay for Silas and Timothy, his mission partners, to stay there in Berea, so he left them there with instructions on where they were to meet him and when and so on. He left Berea and headed south to Athens. Athens at this time was no longer a big military power, but it was the center of art and culture and religion for the Greek people. And so just imagine you are Paul, you're a person who is coming to a city of such great importance, great art and culture and so on, with such a big, rich history. You don't live there. You maybe are there for the first time. What would you do? You'd start walking around. It's time to be a tourist, right? And so Paul does that. He starts walking around. And as he's walking around, this is what Luke tells us. Chapter 17, verse 16, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. We'll stop there. So where Paul was walking is a place in Athens called the Agora. Agora means the marketplace. And if you go there today, you can still see the remnants and the foundations of it. And through archaeology and through descriptions by ancient writers, we can pretty well look and discover what the Agora kind of looked like back then. And the Agora, I know it's kind of hard to read all those words, but basically it was a combination of an open-air market, a city square, a community gathering place, a place where business was transacted, but all throughout it, and these are all the words that you can't read, those words all the way around the outside, it was filled with temples. The Agora had all kinds of shrines and temples and statues to the pantheon of Greek gods, names like Zeus and Hermes and Poseidon and Hades and all the rest of them. One ancient writer quipped about Athens, there are more idol statues in Athens than there are people. As Paul looked around at this, he saw that there was a lot of idol worship going on. And notice Paul's reaction to all of that. Paul did not look at it and say, well, that's art, that's culture. You do you and I'll do me and we'll just go our own separate way, whatever. He didn't look down at them from his religious ivory tower and say, I can't believe how foolish people are these days. Back in my day, we didn't bow down to statues of gold and silver. I can't believe people are so ignorant. He didn't say that. Paul also didn't have zero reaction. Chapter 17, verse 16 says this, Paul was greatly distressed. The word that's behind that is, its very base form means to sharpen. And so what do you do when you sharpen a blade, right? You rub a stone against it over and over and over and over again until it's sharp. That's what the word means. It means to agitate. It means to be provoked. It means to be stimulated. You can use it in medicine in the Greek culture to talk about a seizure. So in other words, what was happening in Paul's heart as he looked around and saw all of these statues? His heart was provoked. His heart was shaking for these lost people. Because he realized that these people, while they were worshiping all these different false gods, were really groping after trying to get something that he had, that he knew about, that he held very closely and tightly and loved. They were trying to find something that everyone is trying to find, trying to fill something that everybody's trying to fill. They were trying to find meaning and purpose and acceptance, love and identity, worth, value. They were trying to fill this hole in their hearts. They were reaching out, trying to tap into the divine that is out there. These this bigger power that is out there that they sensed, that they felt, that they knew was there. They just didn't know what it was. Paul looked at it and he saw they're looking for God and they just don't know who he is. And when he saw that, his heart was shaking. He was angry. He was sad. He was emotional over this whole situation. How about you? How about me? When we see the people in our lives that are lost, is our heart provoked like Paul? Maybe it's the family, the family you know that building their whole identity, the parents that are building their whole identity, their hopes, their dreams, their futures, it's all on the success of their children. They're sacrificing and doing everything possible so that their children succeed and can give their mom and dad all kinds of attention. And so all the weight of their hopes, dreams, and expectations, their future, everything, their identity, it's all leaning on these little children, hoping that these kids will prop them up and hold them up. Or the person that is searching for meaning, for love and acceptance, and just sleeping around all over the place, is filled with all kinds of stimulants, all kinds of narcotics to give some sense or some peace or some respite or some meaning to life, and always feeling empty. Or the person you know that is racing up the corporate ladder, and they're going to step on whomever they have to get to the top. And they're pushing aside and losing and even watching relationships fall apart, friendships they've had for years, maybe even relationships with their children or a spouse. And they get to the top and they look and they think, now I should have meaning. Now everything will be right and wonderful. But they look around and they see there's nobody that's around them to congratulate them because they've destroyed every relationship in life. And the meaning and the identity and the value they thought they'd find there is just, it's missing. Or what happens when you see someone or talk to someone who is searching for God, but they don't know who he is. They don't know what God is. Sometimes our reaction is, well, that's how you live your life. You live your life one way, I live my life another way, and we just kind of go on our merry way. And sometimes we look down our nose from our religious ivory tower at people and say, I can't believe that you would live like that. Can you believe what she's doing to herself? How can they do that to their children? I would never do anything like that. Or perhaps we say nothing. Perhaps there's no reaction. This is why I have the prayer, Lord, give me a heart like Paul, that is provoked for the lost the way he was provoked for the lost in the city of Athens. A heart that is provoked like that knows that at one time, a heart needed to be provoked for him too. Because you see, dear friends, this is the reaction that God has when he looks at our world. When God looks at our life, his heart was provoked with sadness, with anger, with so much emotion, because he saw the lostness in our life. He saw we were groping for him and could not find him. And so God's provoked heart, what did it do? It sent his son into this world. He sent his son into this world, dear friends, to rescue us from our sin, to bring us into peace with God, to give us faith and a right relationship with God, to fill that God-shaped hole in our heart with his presence, with his love, with his peace and his forgiveness. He redeemed us and gave us salvation. His heart was provoked for us, dear friends. A heart that is provoked for the lost, it can't say nothing. It has to say something. It has to do something. And so that's what Paul does. The very next day, the Bible tells us in verse 17 that Paul went to the synagogue. And he started reasoning with the Jews who were there, and they're called God-fearing Greeks. Those are Gentiles who had converted to Judaism. So he starts telling them about the Old Testament, starts telling them about Christ, tries to connect the dots for them. When he's done at the synagogue, he goes back out into the agora, and he starts talking with people. He starts telling them about Jesus, the resurrection of the dead, and all of a sudden, news of Paul's teaching is spreading across Athens, and it reaches a group of men called the Areopagus, the religious and philosophical thinkers in the city of Athens. The Bible even said all they would do is just sit around and talk and think, like a bunch of dudes in a coffee shop, I guess. I don't know. But that's what they would do on a daily basis. They would just think and talk about the latest philosophies and ideas. And they wanted to hear from Paul. What is this new religion, this new philosophy that you're bringing here? And so, Paul was given the opportunity to speak to them. Take a look at verses 22 and 23. This is how Paul begins. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' You are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you." We'll stop there. As I said at the beginning, I think what Paul's sermon, we're not going to read through the whole thing, we're going to jump around to different spots, but his sermon, in my opinion, is a master class in how you talk to somebody who is absolutely biblically illiterate. Somebody who knows nothing about God, nothing about the Bible, has never read it, does not know anything at all. That's what Paul is working with. So notice when Paul gets to the Areopagus, he doesn't say, let me tell you about the old covenant. It was formed in Mount Sinai by a guy named Moses. Let me tell you about Abraham. Abraham. Let me tell you about prophecies in the Old Testament. These people have no connection with the Bible whatsoever. The idea of a resurrection from the dead is offensive and weird to them. It doesn't make any rational sense in their Greek minds. And so what is Paul going to do? Paul looks at them and realizes they are not that different from him. He says, "I see you're all very religious. And you know why I know you're religious? See, I'm religious too, right, Paul? I'm religious. I'm looking for God, and I can tell that you're looking for God too, because as I walked through your city, I saw all kinds of idols. And if you ever get to Athens, it's really cool to stand on Mars Hill, that's where the Areopagus would meet, and to see what was Paul looking at when he says these words. Mars Hill, it's kind of, if you have to look, is where the Areopagus meets. Areopagus means Mars Hill. So the Areopagus meets on Mars Hill, and if you look down at the very bottom, that big open area, that's the Agora. So Paul is standing there on the Areopagus. He's looking down, and he sees the Agora, which we learned earlier is filled with all kinds of idols and temples. He said, "I can see that you're very religious. I walked through that place. I saw the temples to this person and that God and that God and that God and so on." And then you see it's to the left there. There's a big hill. That's called the Acropolis. And if you go to visit the Acropolis today, it's just a lot of rocks and a lot of ruins. But in Paul's day, it was a grand, glorious display. And guess what's on the top of the Acropolis? There's all kinds of temples to the Greek gods, and the biggest of which is the one on the far right. It's called the Parthenon. And the Parthenon was a temple to the goddess Athena. Her statue in the Parthenon was so tall that her head peeked out of the ceiling of it. That's what Paul is looking. When he says, "I can tell you're religious," he says, "I can see it there, I can see it there. I even found," Paul says, "an altar to an unknown God." And that's a really cool one, okay? So in other words, Paul was walking through the Agora, and he saw altar, altar, altar. And then there's an altar that says, "To an unknown God." Now, they've never found that altar there in Athens, but they have found altars like that in the city of Rome. Back in the 1800s, they did some archaeology, and they found, there it is, altar to an unknown God. So what are the Athenians doing? What are they recognizing? First of all, there might be a God out there that we don't know about. I mean, they've got a plethora of gods, right? But there might be one we don't know about who's out there somewhere, and so we got to make sure to sacrifice to that God too. But there's also something really interesting about this altar to an unknown God in the city of Athens. 600 years before Paul showed up, there was a huge plague, some kind of sickness, that was going through the city of Athens. And the Athenians were sacrificing to the Greek gods. They were doing everything possible to cleanse the city. They couldn't get rid of this epidemic, pandemic, whatever it was. Finally, they sent word. They summoned a guy named Epimenides. Epimenides came to the Areopagus, and he said, "You know what you need to do to get rid of this sickness? You need to bring all of your hungry sheep. So all the sheep that you have that are really, really hungry, bring them to the top of the Areopagus, and then we're going to let them go. And they're going to start grazing. And if they happen to stop grazing at some point and lie down, that spot where they lie down is a spot where this unknown God is, where this unknown God has touched the earth. And you need to build an altar there to this unknown God. That's the God you need to sacrifice to, and that's how we're going to get rid of this epidemic that's going through the city of Athens." So the people did it. And the city of Athens, the countryside, was dotted with these altars to an unknown God. And so 600 years later, with that still as part of their history, Paul comes and says, guess what? That God that you didn't know about, that you were trying to sacrifice to 600 years ago, I know who he is, and this is what he's done for you. We're going to kind of just pop through the sermon a little bit. This is what Paul says about God. Verse 24, he said, God made the world. He doesn't live in temples. You can't put God into a box. In other words, he's everywhere. He's transcendent. He also doesn't need anything from us. We don't need to do anything to give to him. That's what the Greek gods, they demanded things. God doesn't really need anything from us. He made every person from one man. Every person is descended from one individual, and God has also marked out the places and times we would live. In other words, God put you in the place you're at right now with the surroundings you have at the particular time, particular boundaries that you have. For what purpose? So that we would reach out to him, because he's not that far away. He's actually all around us. And then he says, you know what, Athenians, now that I've told you about God, you know what, your poets, your poetry, Greek poetry, actually says this very thing, that we come from God, that God is the one who has given us our being, and we are from him. In fact, Paul says, for in him we live and move and have our being. There's a Greek guy who said that. That's not from the Bible. And you know who said, for in him we live and move and have our being? His name is Epimenides. Back in that epidemic, talking about this unknown God, Epimenides said, in this unknown God we live and move and have our being. So in other words, Paul is saying, what you didn't know long ago, I am now giving to you in reality. There is an unknown God out there, but he's made himself known in Jesus Christ. As some of our own poets have said, we are his offspring. So what has Paul been doing this entire time? Paul is just meeting people where they are. Paul takes the people that are in front of him, whatever situation they are in, and says, all right, that's where you're at. I'm going to connect with you there. And building a bridge until he finally gets across that bridge to say, and now I'm going to tell you about Jesus. This God that you don't know, guess what? He has sent his son into this world. And he's going to come back on the last day, and he's going to judge the living and the dead. But he's provided a way for salvation and eternity and life, and it's through Jesus who has risen from the dead. Paul met these people where they were, led them by the hand across this bridge he was building until he got to Jesus. Dear friends, I want you to think again about those people in your life that are lost, that are searching for meaning, purpose, hope, salvation, to have that God-shaped hole filled in their heart. Keep your ears open the next time they start talking. Because every once in a while it'll happen that the real talk, the real thoughts of their heart and their mind start coming out. And they start talking about things that are bigger outside of this world. You know, the friend that goes out camping, a friend that is maybe very arrogant, maybe very non-religious, anything like that, goes out camping way out somewhere in western Colorado, central Colorado. It's dark, very dark at night, and they see the Milky Way. Or a friend who goes and hikes a 14er, gets there at sunrise and gets to watch the sun peek across the horizon. And they come back and they say to you, you realize how amazing that Milky Way is? I mean, we're talking about stars that are literally light years away. We will never visit them. And here I am, just this little bitty speck. How vast and big this universe is. And we're just these little spots in this mass of universe. Or that person who was sitting on the mountain and said, I was just so in awe. What a majestic sight. A carpet of mountains, all four directions, and then the sun pops up over the horizon. It's amazing. Or that person that has achieved so much, that individual that is successful in everything, and then sits down with you and says, why do I feel so empty? I've got all the money I can possibly spend. I've got more relationships than I can deal with. I've got every success imaginable, and yet I feel like I've got nothing. Or the person who has kind of kept you at arm's length. You know, they never want to talk about Jesus, never want to talk about religion, anything like that. And all of a sudden, they are face to face with their mortality. And they say, is this all there is? You mean I worked my whole life and now I've got this disease, this illness, and my time is going to just stop? This is it? And now what has God done? God has maneuvered times and places and boundaries so that you get to hear that thing. So that your heart would be provoked for the person who is desperate for God, desperate for hope, desperate for meaning, groping for Him. And hopefully then you can have a Dionysius moment. So you notice there at the very end of that section that there wasn't a lot of success in Paul's preaching. Some people sneered at him, this is foolish. Others said, yeah, we want to hear more. But all we know of from the city of Athens that day is 2 people that came to faith. You go to the city of Athens today, in the southwest corner of the Acropolis, there's an 830 meter long parkway that you can walk along. And for those of you who are Greek scholars, you're fine. You know exactly what this is, right? No. At the top, there's an O, there's a triangle, there's an O and a sigma. That means road, hadas. And underneath it, it says Dionysiou Aria Bigatu, which means Dionysius. This is the road of Dionysius, the Areopagites, the guy of the Areopagus. One of those converted there in Athens at Paul's sermon was a guy named Dionysius, who was a member of the Areopagus. And he has a street named after him there in the southwest corner of the Acropolis. But think about what God did to make that happen. I don't know where Paul learned about Epimenides. Maybe he was in a school, right? He's sitting in this philosophy class, and there's a professor up front just talking, and Paul's saying to himself, what do I to read this Greek poetry crap? I'm going to be a Pharisee. I'm Jewish. I don't care about the Greeks. Fine, I'll read Epimenides. I'll get my A. Why are we learning this stuff? Moving on with life. And 600 years later, there he is in the city of Athens, standing on the Areopagus, and all of a sudden, Epimenides comes pouring back into his head. And because of all these things Paul learned and all these things that God had maneuvered, there it was, face to face with a man who was lost, named Dionysius, a man whom Paul got to bring to Jesus that day. Dear friends, watch out for your Dionysius moment. The things you are learning right now, the things you are going through, the things that you are experiencing, it's not by chance or coincidence. It's the Lord God who is marking out times and boundaries and seasons and days in your life to bring you face to face with that moment when you are with that person who is desperate for God. And you get to take them by the hand across the bridge and lead them to their Savior. Amen.